So we're talking about sticky prices. That some prices can't change as fast as others. Some prices update themselves more slowly. Because we live in a world that's constantly being battered with supply and demand shocks in both directions. And the market equilibrates on its own. The market naturally seeks its own level, and it tends to do so faster than any central planner could do it. But that doesn't mean it does it equally quickly for different goods. And some things are pretty dang slow. Now, sticky prices are caused by numerous factors. And one of them is what's called menu costs, literal costs of changing the price. So here's a puzzle for you. Why do restaurants change their prices so rarely? Stores change them a little more often. Gas stations change their prices constantly. And stock markets spaz out all day long. Why would the prices be so much more stable for food than for gas? Well, there's different answers a person could propose, but one of the big ones has to do with menu costs. That not all industries that it's not free. It's not free to change your prices. And some industries are going to face higher costs for changing their prices than others. Now, the term menu cost comes from literal menus in restaurants. You have constant little shocks, and so it would be nice to be able to update your prices. Restaurants could, for example, charge more on some days than others. I mean, sometimes they do that, right? They'll have discounts that they advertise. But you could have congestion pricing in a restaurant that's very busy. You could have, low prices during times when it's not as busy. You could have your prices vary by a few pennies. If the truck carrying potatoes for your French fries breaks down on the interstate, then you jack up the French fry prices that day. In theory, they could do all this, but in practice, it's not that practical, or at least it wasn't until very recently. Not that practical because that restaurant has to print up a menu. And menus are not cheap. Menus are not cheap. They can be, especially in a lot of your diners, like little meat and threes around here. They might just have a sheet of paper. They literally printed it off their printer that day, and it costs them almost nothing. But your fancy restaurants, they don't want to look, poor. So they have to have some that's laminated. They have to have some that has design. They've got to hire a professional to design their menu. But this puts them in a bit of a bind. Because if they print up a bunch of expensive menus, then that means every time they want to change any price on the menu, they have to throw out all of them. It's a bit of a problem, right? So now the restaurant has to make a decision. When are the benefits of changing the menu greater than the costs of having to buy all new ones? And the answer is not that often. Restaurants are usually going to tolerate a certain range of prices. They know that sometimes things will be higher, sometimes things will be lower. Sometimes their inputs will be more expensive, like right the ingredients, sometimes they'll be less so. It's a little bit unpredictable, but as long as it stays within this certain range, this interval that they can tolerate, the restaurant can still operate profitably. And if they see that there's some kind of extreme shift in the equilibrium or in their input prices, then they'll update it if the change seems like it's going to be sustained? Is this temporary or is it permanent? Now, not all products are going to be listed on menus. So, for example, have you ever noticed that lobster tends to not be listed with a price? Why? Why lobster specifically? Well, it varies a lot. Lobster has a very unstable supply, especially the quality of a given lobster they get. If they were to put lobster on the menu, they'd either have to change the menu constantly, which wouldn't be cost efficient, or they'd have to leave it the same, but potentially, take losses on lobster regularly. So you see that even within an industry, even within a single business, some goods will be stickier than others. Now, by contrast, an industry like gasoline is very responsive. I think I already brought up the Colonial Pipeline shutdown. I saw it with my own eyes. I survived it. Gasoline normally sits around 230 nowadays, but for one horrible, horrible day, it shot up to 10. Shot up before my eyes. And then it was gone the very next day. Well, that almost seems like the opposite of the restaurant situation. Why would they be willing to change the price just to revert it back so quickly? And the answer is very simple. It was free for them to do it. It didn't cost the restaurant anything, or it didn't cost the gas station anything to change the price. Because what are gas station prices listed on? They're listed on electronic billboards and they're listed on the electronic pumps. They can just go in and type in a different price. And there's actually government regulations that forbid them from changing the prices too frequently. This is going to have a big impact on goods. And then you get into other problems too. Like, for example, this goes back to restaurants mostly, but when you have a brand that is heavily associated with a specific price, you sell a staple good, people are very accustomed to buying it every day at the same price. Or when you have a marketing campaign, you have poured a ton of money into selling this idea. $5 footlongs, dollar menu, so on and so forth. Well, you can't just casually change the price because it undermines your advertising and it runs the risk of a consumer backlash. Consumers are very entitled people, and they will and do freak out when prices get tampered with. This is going to have an impact on the way inflation spreads. The money's circulating around, it circulates to some places earlier than others. But in terms of its impact on driving up the price, that's also going to move faster in some places than others, largely based on how expensive it is to change the prices and how poorly the consumers are going to take it. Now, a little more significant for your lives is the role that contracts play. This is going to have a huge impact. It has an impact on producers and it has an impact on workers. You contract for a good at a specific price, and then inflation begins to take off, but you can't get out of your contract. There's always a way to get out of a contract, but you can't just stop buying from that producer or selling to that purchaser or working at that workplace. In any situation where you have a large presence of contracts, you can expect sticky prices to be much, much worse. And this is especially going to impact workers. And this is going to be the entire reason why inflation is painful for workers. So I've already shown you the argument that in the long run, inflation doesn't affect anything. But we know that it's very, very unpleasant in the short run. And why? Because even though our incomes do eventually go up, they have to go up. That's part of the neutrality of money. Labor is a service like anything else. Wages have to go up, but they don't go up as fast as the prices of goods do. And so we end up losing in the short term. And why do wages increase slower? Well, for the most part, they increase slower due to contracts and also due to the job search process. Because hiring a worker is such a big decision for a company, even for a large company, they don't do it casually. And so people, especially professional types, they expect to spend months on the job market looking for a job. And if you just walk away from a job without fulfilling your obligations to it, that's not going to look good to that next employer. And depending on the nature of your work, you might even be responsible for civil damages. If you walked away from a task you were obligated to complete and it costs the company because of that. People tend to be stuck. You can easily buy less of something, but you can't just easily walk away from your workplace and walk into another one. And because of this, inflation is going to be easier not just on producers than it is on employees, but it's also going to be easier on some kinds of workers than on others. As a rule, businessmen are going to be the people that benefit most from inflation. And that can either mean that they are hurt the least by inflation or that they actually do literally benefit from it. If you sell a product that's at the very start of that ripple effect, that's at the start of that chain reaction, then you get to reap the benefits of all those extra sales without having to pay higher prices on everything yourself. The inflation has just begun. It hasn't circulated fully yet. So businesses can often, you know, make a tidy little profit off of this stuff. Wage slaves, usually they I mean, they're at the bottom of the social pyramid, aren't they? Burger flippers, janitors, unskilled labor in general. Now, you would expect that inflation would hit them especially hard because they have very low incomes. But they do have one thing going for them. Because their work is unskilled, it doesn't really cost them anything to just leave them behind. And there's always somebody in this world looking for another burger flipper. Amazing as it was to see that $10 a gallon gas in Central, it was also amazing to see $15 an hour wages being paid by the fast food places. So it used to be everybody was making $7.25. If you flip burgers for a living, you're making minimum wage. And of course, you're only making minimum wage because it's the minimum wage. If they would take that away, they'd be getting $3. and they deserve it too. Your average fast food worker, in my experience, is a druggie, a degenerate. Of course, you also have your people who are just doing it as a temporary job. You know, they're in between jobs or it's a part-time job like in college. But there's a reason why they're paid so little. Well, along comes COVID and screws the whole world up. I say COVID screws the world up. The COVID lockdown screwed the world up. The COVID stimulus bill screwed the world up. And they just dump money on the economy, double the monetary base. Suddenly, the prices of everything start skyrocketing. They're offering extremely generous welfare to people. And so the wages decide, you know, I don't really want to work. And who can blame them? The equilibrium price of a burger flipper had increased dramatically. And so they had to start offering them higher wages. Any drive-through you go through, they all advertise this. They all, you know, they all have flyers up in the windows begging people to come work for them for 15 bucks an hour. Twice what they used to make, and yet they still struggle to get the workers because that's still a shitty deal. But the thing is, those folks, they had that ability. They had that market power that if you don't like your job at Wendy's, you'll just run over to Taco Bell. If you don't like your job at Taco Bell, you'll go work for Cookout. Because they're so interchangeable, it's easy to find another job, which ends up giving them quite a bit of bargaining power. Burger Flipper's not going to bargain themselves into a $50 an hour, wage, but they could bargain themselves into a wage increase at a time when other people couldn't. So people at the low end of the income distribution, they suffered more from inflation in the very short term because it's harder to cut back. You have people that live paycheck to paycheck that can't cut back, but their salvation, their incomes going up, their wage increases came much faster. Likewise, you would expect inflation to be easier on self-employed tradesmen and professionals. People who work a wage or who contract on their own, but they're skilled labor. They make good, incomes, have high earnings. You're talking electricians, plumbers, potentially a lot of factory workers who have some specific skill, like welders. People that might be working for an employer, but they have a rare skill that's in such high demand that they could easily find another factory. And of course, people like your lawyers and doctors and stuff too. If you set your own wages, or if you have a lot of bargaining power because you have a niche that's in high demand, then inflation's not going to hurt you as much. You would expect their incomes to be less sticky. But the class that really gets screwed over by inflation is sort of your middle class white collar workers. People that don't have a specific technical skill like the tradesmen do, and who are salarymen. They're kind of stuck with their employer for a year at a time, and who can't just easily find another job. They might have a narrow niche, but it's not a narrow niche that lends itself to them just walking away. You don't just boldly stride out into the job market and say, okay, who wants to hire me? You know, it was that white collar middle class that really got cheated by all of this. I got cheated by all of this. Um, Graduate students may be one of the stickiest kinds of employees in the world because we cannot transfer our credit to other schools. So, in the past 5 years, I've gotten $500 in raises. It's horrible. Of course, that's part of the rules of the game. You understand when you take on a job like that you have to be planning based on the inflation you expect to happen. But if the inflation happens unexpectedly, then yeah, you just get screwed over.